Hi, welcome back. It's been quite a week here in the UK. We've just had a round of local elections, not all of the country, but quite a large part of it. We certainly had it here in Lincolnshire. We had a vote for the Mayor of Greater Lincolnshire, which is they've actually combined all the boroughs of Lincolnshire to have one mayor, and we've also had the local election votes as well. That across the country has been quite staggering. We've gone from a two-party system. Traditionally it's been a battle between Labour and Conservative, with a couple of the other parties very far behind. Tends to be the Liberal Democrats and the Greens. And we've now got a new party at the forefront, Reform, which is what used to be UKIP, I suppose, the Nigel Farage run party. They've moved away from the UKIP ideology across to Reform, which has kind of been created, I suppose, to address the problems that the large majority of the UK population have had with both the Conservatives and Labour as well, which is just their lack of ability to do anything about certain hot button subjects, things that the left refer to as populism, dog whistle type subjects, and we'll get onto that phrase in a few minutes. But Reform are now doing very well. They've surprised everyone. They've taken control of my county, Lincolnshire, in both the mayoress is Reform, and also the council is mostly Reform run now. So very, very strong presence here, but across the country we've seen similar things. They gained a huge amount of seats, Labour lost seats, and Conservatives lost a huge amount of seats. So both Labour and Conservatives lost seats to Reform. The Liberal Democrats picked a few up as well, but nowhere near as much as Reform. They certainly came out of this on top. If this was a view of things to come at the next general election, you would have to say that Labour and Conservatives, especially the Conservatives, would be extremely concerned. I have no doubt they're both now drafting up stronger details in some of their manifesto and policy to kind of appease the situation. But I have to say the public have very little faith in either of those parties. No matter how strong their wording, they have both failed. Even though they've said they were going to do things, they've both failed to enact those things. So I think it's almost too late for those things to occur, unless Labour actually started doing things pretty quickly, and they would have to take a dramatic U-turn on some of their policies, and they would upset the majority of hardcore left-wing Labour voters. Then I don't think people will have faith that they're actually going to change. So what's going on? What are these hot button subjects? And this has been something I've wanted to talk about for quite a long time. It was actually made very difficult because we had some riots here in the UK not so long ago, and it actually criminalised the subject matter. We saw people being shipped off to prison literally for making Facebook posts about the subject of immigration. Those people had made calls for violence, or they had reposted calls for violence, so I can understand they had broken the law in that respect. But the speed at which they had been sent to prison and the length of the sentences certainly raised a few eyebrows with people, considering that some of them were given lengthier sentences than, say, a sex offender, for example. And the speed at which they went to court, got through the court and then into the prison system was like a matter of days, whereas we've seen some heinous crimes committed and it's taken years for these people to actually come to justice. So that surprised a lot of people, and it certainly made people very concerned about talking on this subject. There's also this issue of if you say anything on the internet that someone else says that they find offensive, that could be recorded as some kind of non-crime hate speech or whatever it is. I can't remember the exact wording, but it would result in basically the police coming and knocking at your house, something I've obviously chosen to avoid. But we have seen a political shift now. Labour have already announced that they intend to start publishing data regarding ethnicity and crime. I think they're hoping that there's going to be no correlation, but unfortunately, some of this data is already available. I'll put some up on the screen for you. The Telegraph not my favourite of papers, but they did actually make a freedom of information request and got some of this data out, and it makes for really very concerning reading. You know, a lot of the time the left will say, oh, but crimes are committed by all sorts of people, you know, we don't need to break it down into ethnicity. And if you look at crime overall, then immigrants commit very little crime. But if you look at it overall, that's the wrong way of studying that data. You have to look at it by ethnic group. Are they overrepresented in that type of crime? So if you looked at violent crime, for example, is there a certain ethnic group that, even though they might make up 2% of the population, are they overrepresentative in that specific area of crime? And the statistics bear that out, that they certainly are. In some of them, they are massively overrepresented. I mean, in terms of like violent crime, I think Albania was massively overrepresented there, that they were much more likely to commit violent crime than, say, someone that was born and bred in the UK. So that has concerns, and it also gives weight to the concerns that the majority of the UK public have had, where they've been condemned as being far right. You know, that's often the call that left-wing politicians have made, saying this is far right, it's conspiracy theory, this isn't true. And actually now the statistics are bearing out that everything that people were thinking along those lines kind of is true. We also have data from other European countries, Denmark, Sweden, all of which bears out pretty much the same story, that the immigrants were considerably more likely to commit certain types of crime than the population that already existed there. Now, this wasn't the case a few years ago. If you go back 10 or 15 years, we've always had immigration in the UK. I was born up in a very multicultural area of the UK, and none of this was really an issue. We had lots of different cultures here. A lot of them had come over for specific job types. You know, we had a lot of people from the West Indies that obviously came over during, I think, the 70s and 80s. They were brought over to work in like the tube system in London, the trains, and many other nationalities similar. So we had a high percentage of the Sikh population came over here. A lot of them were becoming shop owners, etc. We had a lot of doctors that were coming over from India. We had lots and lots of Filipino nurses coming over. We had a lot of Polish come over as farm workers. No one had any issues with any of that. So the idea that we've been a long-term, you know, racist population and we just hate immigrants, that really isn't borne out if you look back, because that's never been the case. There is a hardcore group of racist people in this country, just like all countries. So there's no denying that. You know, there's definitely groups of these people, like if you trace the roots of the BNP back and Combat 18 and all those different very small niche groups, they were no doubt racist. They're like white supremacist groups, and you will find racism everywhere if you look for it, but it tends to be a very small minority. Generally speaking, I think Britain is probably one of the most accepting countries that I visited. I visited a lot of countries that are quite racist that no one likes to talk about. You know, some of the Asian countries I've been to are quite racist towards people that are black, for example, and no one really likes to discuss that. But it's certainly something I've noticed. Some of the Eastern European countries the same, you know, they are quite racist in their general beliefs. No one really likes to discuss that. England seems to carry the can for a lot of it. But where has this sentiment come from? Because the type of immigration has been changing over probably the last 15 years, we've started to see a difference between people that are coming here specifically to do a job. For example, we needed people to come over and do some work agriculturally, so the Polish were coming over and doing that. There was a very specific reason for them to come, and they came here with that in mind, and they got on with what they needed to be doing. Now we've moved into a situation where people are just randomly turning up with a hope that they're going to get some good treatment, that they're going to get a hotel, that they're going to get some free handouts. And it's kind of like an economic migrant situation, which again is something that's been disputed a lot by left-wingers, that they've said that's ridiculous. A lot of these people are asylum seekers and they're fleeing for their lives. but that isn't what the UK public are actually finding. And some of the attitudes of these asylum seekers, that when they get here they're complaining about their food, they're complaining about their living standards because they clearly expected a lot more, even though they're being put up in hotels. You know, if I was running from certain death and horrific treatment and torture and abuse, even if someone gave me a tent, a sandwich and an apple, I would be over the moon happy about that, right? You know, I'd be like, thank God I'm not being killed, you know, thank God for this, my family's safe, I'm safe. But what we're actually seeing is a huge proportion of young, you know, fit looking males coming from certain areas of the world, arriving here and basically saying that they're being persecuted, they're under the threat of death if they stay in their own country. They've travelled through numerous countries to get here. We're an island, don't forget. So they've travelled through numerous countries. If they just wanted to get safe, they could have stopped at the nearest safe haven. They didn't do that. They chose to keep risking their lives. They've travelled across the channel in a inflatable dinghy, so they've risked their lives to get here despite the fact that they were already safe in France or whichever shore that they came from. And then they're hoping for, you know, some decent treatment here. And when they don't get that, they're kind of showing a bit of attitude about it. They're not very happy with that at all. So that's rubbed people up the wrong way. Then we've had this kind of escalation of criminal activity, which I think people have seen with their own eyes. They've certainly noticed it, but they've been almost gaslit by the government for quite a few years now and told, no, you know, you're misinterpreting what you're seeing. This is just an anomaly. There's nothing really going on here to do with race or culture or religion. It's just people commit crime. It just so happens that those are the people that are being thrust into the news. They're not committing more crime than, say, a white British person is. That was the political line on it. This really came to the forefront with what is called the grooming gangs scandal. So I'm making this video partially for people all across the world, not really people in the UK because they already know about all this stuff, but just so you have a greater understanding of it if you're from America, because I get asked a lot. And the grooming gang scandal really brought the public's interest into this situation because it involved children and the abuse of children, horrific abuse of children, and possibly the involvement of government and police in order to kind of take eyes away from what was happening maybe and to put people off. And I'm not giving my opinion on this, I'm just telling you the opinion of the general person in the UK if you ask them about this subject. It's certainly borne out in some of the data that there was clearly efforts made to not sow division in the community, like racial division. So a lot of this was suppressed to a level that they didn't want this to kind of make headlines, and there seems to be a suppression of it at some level. I haven't done enough investigation to find out exactly who and what that suppression was, but that seems to be the general consensus. The grooming gang situation is generally males of Pakistani origin are seeking out young white girls. This is the general consensus again, and this is borne out in the courts. You know, we've seen quite a lot of these groups go through the court system now. And again, the left wing would say, yeah, but most of the groomers are white English males. That's true if you just look at sex crimes in general. If you just look at sex crimes in the UK, you would see the biggest percentage are white males. That's because they make up the biggest percentage in the UK. So of course they make up the larger percentage because they are the larger percentage by a very large margin. But if you were to actually break it down by ethnicity, you'd see, you know, if you have an ethnic group that makes up only about 2.8% of the population, but they're doing 14% of the crime in that specific area, there's obviously an issue going on there. And that's what people have been seeing going through the courts. People have been raising questions about that. Only the other day, a Labour MP was asked about this on a radio show, and she said, oh, you know, get your little trumpet out. Oh, you're blowing a dog whistle. And this has caused absolute furore among the British public, who are horrified that she would say such aloof, arrogant and disgusting comments about such a heinous crime, you know, something that's been pretty much institutional, that seems to have been covered up, that's involved the mass abuse of young British children. And she just says, oh, it's a political dog whistle. And by saying dog whistle, she means, oh, you're making a political point score with me. And she's kind of arrogantly dismissing them. But she fails to recognise that, in fact, we're talking about real crimes with real victims, some of them that have been horrifically tortured by these grooming gangs, some have even died, and that's not something that you really want to be trying to play a political point scoring game on. You know, people are rightfully concerned about the safety of children in the UK. It's quite understandable that they would bring these sort of things up. That's not a political point score. That is a legitimate concern about the safety and security of your family, your country, and the other people's children as well. But that's something that the British public, I think, have been noticing. They've been very frustrated at the politicians' refusal to acknowledge any of this because they're concerned it's going to create some kind of racial division. And look, if it creates racial division or not, I think we should be very careful about hiding the truth from people. Because when you hide the truth that's in plain sight and people can still see what's going on, there will always come a point where those people realise they've been lied to. That inflames the situation even more. So I would argue that actually, if these issues had been discussed in the first place very openly, yes, it would have created a small amount of racial division maybe and a bit of unpleasantness. But actually, if it had been dealt with, people would have been in general a lot happier and things would have been kind of better over time. What's happened now is that, you know, the government have tried to keep a lid on these things. It's like a pressure cooker, and in the end it's boiled over to a situation like we had where people actually went out on the streets and started throwing rocks around and started setting fire to things. I'm very much against people doing that kind of thing on either side. You know, I don't want to see violent interactions in the street. I don't want to see death threats. But I do think the government have some responsibility to take there, that they've created that pressure cooker situation by their own refusal to deal with any of these issues, and in the end it's blown up in their faces. So that they have not taken responsibility for that at all. They've literally just blamed what they refer to as the far right. Now, they would say that anyone that was kind of pro having a very secure immigration policy was far right, but then that class is my mother, my 83-year-old mother, who's a very sweet lady, never broken the law in her life, so apparently she's far right. She doesn't even know what far right is, but she understands that her community has changed. She feels unsafe herself, and she doesn't like what's happening in the country. She also sees an erosion of the culture, and that's something that a lot of countries wouldn't put up with. You know, could you imagine me going to an Arabic country, for example, or going over to Pakistan and, you know, trying to erode their culture and then instill my own culture? That wouldn't go down very well these days. I don't think I would last very long there. I certainly wouldn't be given a free hotel and you know, a free handout of food every week. I would be probably cast out immediately and deported, sent back to the UK. So it's rather bizarre that the politicians won't discuss that either. You know, when people bring that up and say, you know, we're concerned about our heritage and our culture, and I can completely understand people's feelings in that regard. When you look at some of these very small villages where you might have a population of a few hundred people, and suddenly they move 200 guys from Somalia into that village, that in itself is a massive cultural change for that village. You know, they've been like they have been. Even if I moved into that village with my family, it would be a shift for them, because suddenly some guy from a completely different part of the country has moved into our village. You know, I've moved into these villages before. When I first moved to Lincolnshire, I remember people in the village kind of looking at me sideways and being a bit thrown out, and I understood that because it was a small, close-knit community. They weren't used to change. And then suddenly you're going to throw like 200 plus guys from a completely different culture, a completely different religion, many of which can't even speak the language. They're now going to be just wandering around these villages aimlessly with nothing to do. And you think that that's not going to upset the equilibrium of the people there, and that you're going to call those people racist if they complain? You've totally changed their lifestyle completely overnight. You know, they've gone from like something that they found completely normal to just expecting them to cope with something completely different overnight. Why should they have to do that? You know, to me, that's completely obscene. And the people that are making this happen, they do not live in these communities. You know, I guarantee you won't find a migrant hotel next door to Mr. Starmer's house or any of the other politicians that are pushing this through. You know, they live in very pleasant neighbourhoods where they'll say, oh, I live in a multicultural neighbourhood. What they mean is that the Indian man down the road, he's actually a plastic surgeon that's a millionaire, you know. So yeah, they're multicultural, but in a slightly different way. When you actually move from a multicultural neighbourhood in a very, very rich area to a poverty-stricken area, there's very different things happening there. You know, you cannot draw any sort of symmetry between those two at all. In poverty-stricken areas, people tend to become tribal. Because they're all fighting over the scraps, right? They haven't got huge amounts of money. They're not living in 7-bedroom detached houses with 3 acres of ground to mess around on. They're crammed into these tiny little council houses, and they've got very, very small amounts of money. So they all begin to bicker with one another, and it becomes a very tribal situation. So you're really driving rivalry like that. The idea that you're going to throw people into that kind of poverty-stricken area and they're all going to just randomly get on with each other, that's never been borne out at all in history. It's never worked out that way, and it probably never will. And of course the politicians must know this. They're not stupid. I know a lot of people like to call them stupid. I don't believe they're stupid. I just think they're aloof. It doesn't affect them. They live in their grandiose houses and second homes and whatever perks and bungs they're getting, £20,000 worth of clothing or whatever, and they're just unaffected by it. So they like to tell us what we have to put up with, because we're just the plebs on the ground, you know, that have to do what we're told. We have to put up with our lives being turned upside down, but it won't affect them, so they're not at all concerned. One of the hot topics is our membership of ECHR, the European Court of Human Rights. That membership has enabled quite a lot of criminals to stay within this country, criminals that have come from other countries, committed crime, and then appealed and used the ECHR as a reason to be able to stay in this country, and it's become impossible to deal with them. You cannot deport them. I would argue that was actually the death nail for the Conservative government, that they at one point had a chance to go down that route, and they would have taken some flack for it, sure. They would have been, you know, the extreme leftists would have all screamed about, oh my God, our human rights have disappeared, this is terrible, you're fascist, you know. They would have taken some flack, but they would have retained the large majority of people that were voting for them, that were currently giving them a majority and allowing them to stay in government. If they had gone down that route, they would probably still be in power now, because people would have actually seen change. They could have said, yes, we're deporting these foreign criminals, they won't be staying here anymore, the taxpayer won't be paying for them to sit in prison, we're going to get rid of them to their own countries. Everyone would have been very happy about that. Instead, they chose to stay with the ECHR, and that meant basically we just carried on as we were. They promised that things would happen in terms of deportations and stuff. It never did. It all got blocked because of the ECHR mainly. And Labour have done exactly the same. And of course it's killing them as well. They've got some policy that they're enacting. It seems to me their policy is just to process asylum seekers as fast as possible and give them all residency. And then they don't have to worry about deporting anyone if they become residents, and they're no longer illegal immigrants, they're no longer asylum seekers, they're now members of the community and they're residents in the UK, so they take them out of the statistics that way. They're talking a lot about toughening up the border, but no one's actually seen any of that happening, and it certainly hasn't affected the amount of small boats arriving in the country. They're now discussing student visas, which, to be honest, is kind of the easiest thing for them to tackle, because these students, yeah, some of them overstay their welcome. If they do, most of them kind of want to get a job. If they've actually come over here to go to university, they're obviously not just lazy blaggers. You know, they've got some money behind them in order to pay for that. They've been able to go through a university course which shows a bit of aptitude. I don't think they're the people that the British public are particularly concerned about. I've never heard anyone going, oh my God, these international students are really terrorising us. That's the least of their worries in terms of migration. But of course, it's a really, really soft and easy way for politicians to say, look, we've reduced the amount of migrants coming to the country just by stopping these students overstaying their welcome. Reform look to be pushing to get out of the ECHR so that then they have freedom to actually deport these criminals. That has captured the public's interest. I think what's captured their interest the most is that Reform are actually offering a chance to follow through on what they've said, and we've already seen that the other parties haven't been able to do that. So that's borne out historically, that they've lied, they haven't followed through, and that Reform are one of the only ones that have given a really hard line on the things that people want a hard line on. They haven't had a chance to actually enact any of that stuff yet, but people are voting for them in hope that it will work out. So I'm going to see what happens in Lincolnshire. Now we've got a county that's pretty much governed by Reform. They're certainly in the majority, and we'll see what happens here over the next few months. I'll give some updates probably and let you guys know, and we're going to see what happens to the rest of the country as well. There's going to be local elections coming up in other areas quite soon. I already spoke to a couple of guys I know in Wales, and they feel that Reform are going to do really well over there as well. I think they already have done quite well in one area. So that will be interesting to see what happens in Wales, what happens in Scotland, what happens to the rest of the country. Some of the counties were deferred in terms of election. There was some concern that maybe this deference was done by the government to lower the amount of damage they took from this first round, because they certainly took some serious damage, and I think by splitting it up, it splits up the amount of damage they're taking as well. So they take quite a bit now, then they take quite a bit then. Maybe that's better than having all that damage inflicted at once, which probably would have ended Starmer's career. I would imagine within the Labour Party there are already calls to get rid of Starmer because he's doing terribly. He's deeply unpopular even with Labour voters. I think his popularity at the moment is about -40, in line with Meghan Markle. So that kind of gives you an idea of what people think of that guy. He did himself no favours in the first month that he became Prime Minister. He talked a lot about being noble and being different to the corrupt Conservatives. Then he proceeded to take about £20,000 worth of free clothing off his millionaire mate, got a bunch of free tickets to all these different events, basically just, you know, spending all these bungs and what in the civilian world would actually be called bribes. You know, if I'm working and someone gives me a gift that's worth more than £25, that is actually classed as a bribe by the Bribery Act that most of us workers have to do if we're working internationally. But apparently if you're a politician, that doesn't fall within the Bribery Act. You get special dispensation as a politician, so you can take pretty much anything you want as long as you've written it down. So that's what Starmer said after that. He said, it's not corrupt because, you know, I've noted it all down that I've taken these things. So that really pleased everyone when their energy bills were going through the roof because of these green net zero policies. And whilst the winter heating allowance was being cut from old age pensioners and farmers were being absolutely steamrolled for inheritance tax, at the same time Starmer's writing down £20,000 worth of free luxury suits from my millionaire mate, and that was absolutely fine. So he absolutely crucified himself within the first month or so of coming into power. I thought he was quite an intelligent guy, being the ex-director of public prosecutions. Clearly he may be intelligent academically, but he obviously lacks the kind of intelligence where you have an understanding about how you're perceived, a bit more of an emotional intelligence, let's say. I really can't stand the guy, and I try to keep my political affiliations off of this channel because I want to present just how people feel in general and the mood of the country. It's not about how I feel and what I want to see, but it gets a bit difficult when I talk about him because I really don't think he's of benefit to the Labour Party or to this country either. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know in the comments below what you think on these subjects. Let me know if you're voting reform, if you did vote reform, or if you didn't and you can't stand them, what are your reasons for not liking them? I'll be very interested to hear. As always, keep your comments sensible, adult, clean. Any extremist, illegal, abusive comments, what I will delete. YouTube will probably remove them anyway. I get a few people say, hey, my comment got removed. Yes, the filters I've got set will remove comments that have got a bunch of swear words in or anything calling for violence. Some of that stuff occasionally gets through the filter. If it does and I see it, I will moderate it out immediately. I don't want any of that on the channel. This is not a place for abusive, unpleasant discussion. It's a place for open, frank, truthful and honest discussion on these subject matters, because that's the only way we can move forward as a civilized society. Thanks very much. Take care. I'll catch you all next time.